Are Christians on a roller coaster? People today often hear about how much the Bible has changed over the centuries. If we do not know what was originally written, how can a person trust it? And they rightfully point out that some books were left out. Furthermore, all the different versions seem to tell a different story. This controversy is at the heart of today's video. For over 25 years, I have engaged in discussions in Christian apologetics with a focus on meticulous analysis. Similar to how a plowman removes obstacles from a field to improve agricultural conditions, my objective is to eliminate common challenges faced by Christians, therefore fostering a deeper faith in Christ. First, I will address the accusations. Critics claim that there are over 200,000 errors in the New Testament alone. Technically, this is true, but highly misleading. We will get into the issue of why it is misleading in a moment. Critics also claim that some Gospels were left out because the Christian leaders did not like the message. And because of all the different versions, critics also claim that we don't know what was originally in the Bible. Again, both are true, but highly misleading. Last, there is the claim that only the King James Bible is reliable. In this video, I'm going to address the specifics of the New Testament and the Old Testament. The New Testament will include the Apocrypha, which is the category of manuscripts that the Gospel of Thomas belongs. Meanwhile, the discussion on the Old Testament will include the deuterocanonical books, which are those manuscripts written between the Old and New Testaments. Last, I will cover a number of the Bible versions and why they are different from each other. The 27 books of the New Testament were made of papyrus. Papyri were made from pressing reeds from the Nile River into layers, with each layer perpendicular to the previous layer. But when were these books written? As I pointed out in my radiometric dating fraud video, the margin of error on this dating method is too wide to determine if the authors of these manuscripts had the inside knowledge to make their claims. Because of the composition of the manuscripts, copies rarely survived for long periods. In addition, the Roman Empire persecuted those who would write such material, destroying their writings in the process. About 250 years after Jesus, the Roman Empire reversed course, but the damage may have been irreparable by then. So how do Bible scholars know when these books were originally penned? Bible scholars can date each manuscript by its contents, much like a person today can date a movie by the images within that movie. If a movie contains views of the Twin Towers, one will know that the movie must have been filmed while those towers still stood. Likewise, if the movie contains props of smartphones, it had to have been filmed after they were invented. One of the keys Bible scholars use to date the New Testament manuscripts is the existence of the temple in Jerusalem. If the manuscript is written in a manner that indicates that the temple was still standing, then it was likely written before 70 AD. If it was written without the temple, then it was likely written after its destruction. Another tool that scholars use is the early writings of church leaders. A historian writing about President Washington could have only done so after he was elected to the presidency. Likewise, a church father writing about the book of John saying, "In the beginning was the Word," then the book of John had to have existed prior to this church father. Using this and similar information, conservative scholars date the books of the New Testament between 40 and 95 AD. As a reminder, Jesus was crucified on April 12, 35 AD, so the earliest writings were a mere 5 years after Jesus rose from the grave. The earliest fragment of a book within the New Testament is dated to about 125 AD. After that point in history, the fragments increase in number and size until around 350 AD, and we get the entire 27 books of the New Testament in a single book. But how does one know if the original words were not changed? The early church fathers frequently copied their version of a book and sent this copy to other church leaders. Furthermore, scholars would make copies for their own personal use from a nearby copy. This activity produced a lot of copies. Most of these copies were translations, often into Latin or Aramaic, but there are over 5,800 copies in the original Greek language. From these Greek copies, we know that they are 99.9% identical. Scholars wanted to see how much these Greek versions varied, so they did a comparison with a computer. They found that they were all within 99.9% in perfect agreement. The only changes were minor, like spelling, word order, and such. But if they are in agreement, how do scholars claim that there are over 200,000 errors in the New Testament? This factoid comes from the difference between a scholarly error and what most people consider to be an error. In 1 Thessalonians, we see one such error where a scribe incorrectly copied a word, changing it from gentle to little children. Now, if this error was copied over to 1,000 copies, then scholars would consider this to be 1,000 errors. Thus, minor errors get magnified quickly, reaching the scholarly level of 200,000 errors in the New Testament. But most people would ignore these errors. In recent years, scholars have obtained older copies of the various books within the Bible, allowing them to determine which wording was in the original manuscript. As such, there's limited ability to distort the message into another meaning. Furthermore, with the websites we have available today, we can look up the original word and the meaning ourselves and decide if the translation seems valid. This pretty much quashes any claims of changed doctrine within the New Testament. But what about those books left out of the New Testament? Those not among the 27 books that were blessed? There are a large number of manuscripts that were not included in the Bible, too many to address in one short video. So I have decided to focus on one of these books that is well known, the Gospel of Thomas. This manuscript is a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. Because they are short statements, they do not provide much material to evaluate, unlike the Gospels, for example. However, scholars have determined that they are a mixture of truth and falsehood, which is the same technique that Satan used to fool Adam and Eve in the garden. But how was this conclusion reached? All the evidence indicates that this manuscript was originally penned around 150 AD, which was more than 100 years after Jesus. Furthermore, church leaders were on the lookout for false teachings. One such leader, Hippolytus, penned a manuscript calling out the number of false teachings. In his Refutation of All Heresies, he mentioned the Gospel of Thomas, declaring it false. It could not be traced to anyone known to have walked with Jesus, and it contradicted the message of the other 27 books. In short, it was branded as a copycat, trying to add false teaching to water down the Christian faith. The other books that were excluded followed a similar path before they were excluded. Some of them were written much later. None are known to have been written before 125 AD, which means that none of the authors could have met Jesus. There are 39 books in the Old Testament that were written on sheepskin. Sheepskin is more durable than many other mediums, so it was treasured for documents. Being organic, sheepskin will break down in time. Thus, it is unrealistic to expect any original manuscript to survive until today. The Jewish scholars also recognized this fact, so copies were made regularly as an old copy's life came to its end. As a result, we don't have many copies to compare, unlike those of the New Testament. The most complete set of copies of the Old Testament are known as the Masoretic text. These copies all date to around 900 AD, with some as early as 500 AD. This collection is used to translate the Old Testament into English today. Scholars also have another set of copies called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Each manuscript will vary in its date, but they all date between 200 BC and 70 AD, when Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed. There are various opinions on where this collection originated, with some claiming a religious sect that was nearby and others claiming that it was from the temple. In my opinion, it was the official collection from the temple because only 20% of the collection came from the Old Testament. Much of this collection would be considered government records, like land transfers, taxes, and such. I do not believe that a religious sect would have a lot of government records. But how does this collection compare to the Masoretic text? They are nearly identical. This is the best that scholars can claim because the state of preservation of the scrolls within this collection. These scrolls were carefully rolled up, and another tarred-covered sheepskin wrapped around it to preserve the valuable scroll. Next, these scrolls were placed into jars, which were then sealed, again using tar on the lid. These scrolls were, necessarily, stored with one end down, usually with the top in the down position. Over the thousands of years, gravity and decay took its toll. Thus, the top of the scroll gradually broke into fragments, leaving about 80% of the original scroll intact. Some of these fragments have been pieced together, but it is rare for any scroll to be completely intact. Again, scholars wanted to see how much the writing had changed over time, so they compared a chapter from the book of Isaiah with the copy from the Masoretic text. What they found is that there were only 17 letters that were different between the two. Again, most were stylistic changes, but one word was added. If we extend this level of accuracy to the entire Old Testament, then there's not a lot of room for distortion to corrupt the message of the Old Testament either. But the Protestant Bible is slightly different from the Catholic Bible, which is also different from the Orthodox Bible. These differences refer to those books that are not in either of the Old or the New Testament. These books are collectively referred to as the Deuterocanonical books, combining the Greek words for second and measuring rod. There were 15 manuscripts written between the Old and New Testament that were included in the original translation process into Latin. St. Jerome completed this translation process, but he considered them as church writings rather than divinely inspired writings. In essence, they were valuable for history, but they did not come from God. Thereafter, religious leaders differed in the opinion of whether they were divinely inspired or not. One faction split off into our Catholic denomination today, and they selected some of these books as divinely inspired. Another faction split off into the Orthodox denomination of today, with a slightly different set of books that were considered divinely inspired. This difference of opinion, along with other theological differences, split the original Christian church into the various denominations found today. The justification the Protestants had for dismissing these books as divinely inspired include the Jewish leaders had also dismissed them, there is no evidence of God's inspiration, like prophecies or miracles, and there are known inaccuracies within some of these books. For example, the Book of Judith claims that Nebuchadnezzar was the king over Assyria, but he was a Babylonian king and ruled from Babylon, not Nineveh. As the breakup of the church reached full swing, the Catholic Church decided to add 7 of these books into their version in 1546. In my opinion, there is only one church. There should not be a Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant church, as this is contrary to Scripture. But I will get off my soapbox for now. So, why do we have so many different versions? To answer this question, I need to provide some background. All Bibles use the Masoretic text as their foundation for the Old Testament, but different versions use different sources for the translation of the New Testament. Let me paint a picture for you. The Roman Empire is waning, but the Christian leaders are still making copies and collecting these copies into their various libraries. There are 2 important collections, one called the Byzantine and the other called the Alexandrian. The Roman Empire was situated in today's Italy, and the Byzantine Empire was situated in modern-day Turkey. The only relevant information here is how the name Byzantine comes into this discussion, as many of the New Testament manuscripts passed through Asia Minor into the rest of the Roman Empire. This conduit became known as the Byzantine text. Many copies of the New Testament were made and distributed from this source. Thus, any errors that were made got replicated many times. This collection is also called the majority text for its numerous copies. Meanwhile, the Alexandrian collection, located in Alexandria, Egypt, was overrun by the expanding Islamic Empire. Its collection was stored in a room and forgotten to time. Recently, this collection was rediscovered, hence we now have the Alexandrian text. Since this collection is usually dated earlier than the majority text, scholars consider it to be more accurate. However, its incorporation into modern translations has been a slow process, with the older Bible versions using the majority text and the newer ones relying more on the Alexandrian text. As the breakup of the church occurred, a group called the Protestants decided to make their own translation into modern languages. The Catholic leadership was opposed to this idea and refused to loan them their copies of the New Testament. However, the Protestants had a medieval copy called the Textus Receptus, which means received text. Unfortunately, the Textus Receptus was not considered a sacred copy, so some notes were added in the margins and elsewhere. One such note is found in the book of John, which has the story of the stoning of the woman caught in adultery. The translators dutifully copied these notes into the translations as if they were part of the original text. From this manuscript comes our modern King James Version. Note that I do not fault the translators of the King James Version, as they used the best material that they had and did their best to make an accurate translation. Furthermore, some people prefer the nostalgic language found in the King James. So that explains how we got the King James, but what about the other versions? The Protestant efforts did accomplish one goal. The Catholic leaders were forced to translate the Bible into English, ditching the Latin. This version is known as the Revised Standard Version, and so the race was on to translate the Bible. Some leaned toward an accurate translation, while others leaned toward an easily read translation. Now there are a large number of translations available. The word-for-word translations include the New American Standard Bible and the English Standard Version. However, they may be more difficult to read and understand. At the other end of the scale are the paraphrase translations, like The Message and the New Living Translation. I tend to recommend these translations for new Christians, as it makes their transition into Christian living easier. However, I do not recommend these translations for the experienced Christians because of the liberties taken in the translation process. These liberties give rise to the confusion that surrounds the Bible, where critics claim that the Bible has been corrupted into a politically correct message. In short, paraphrase translations are like training wheels when learning to ride a bike. Use them for a limited time. The middle ground between these two extremes are the thought-for-thought translations, like the New Revised Standard Version and the New International Version. My practice is to use these sorts of translations for my casual reading, but a word-for-word translation when I'm doing my serious studies. Another limitation will be the version's availability. For example, I like to listen to my Bible at times. Some versions are not available in the audio format, so this must be considered as well. And since a copy of the Bible does not cost a lot these days, why not have different versions for each purpose? Thus, each Christian will need to use the translation that best suits their needs at that particular point in their journey toward God. They must also realize that those needs will change, so one version won't suit them for life. And that wraps up today's topic. I covered this topic and many others in my book, Christianity versus Naturalism. If you're interested in similar topics, it is a good book to read.